Welcome back, everybody, to the Rough Draft, my excuse to talk to people who are smarter than me and get inspiration for storytelling and share that with you. I'm very, very excited today because I have Andrew Livecchi with me. He is the author of I'm going to try and pronounce this right, Lays of Athewain. Was that right?
Very good. Yeah.
I have your first two books right here.
Oh,
Son of the Thunder Goddess and Rage of the Raven Queen. Perfect. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm really, really excited. It's been so cool to see your book in so many different places as you've been really pushing to get it in bookstores in the area and having so many signings. Just like the hard work that goes into that is huge, and it's been really inspiring for me to see that. So thank you for joining me.
oh, thank you so much. I'm excited to be here.
Would you be able to kind of start us off by just introducing yourself, like who you are as a writer, and then also giving us the introduction to your series as only the author can?
Yeah. I studied English in university, which is probably the background of a lot of writers. Not that it has to be, but it helps, I think. So I did my undergrad in English and history at Brock, and then I did a master's in English at Brock, and then I still wasn't ready to face the real world and get a real job. So then I did a PhD in English. And after 11 years of consecutive education, I finally graduated. And then I started working as a professor at Redeemer and Sheridan College, uh, so teaching English and humanities, mythology. So I'm still not really in the real world, but I am working finally. In my program, I feel like a lot of people who go into English, they're kind of like either we are writers or we're like dream of being writers. So like um I was more in the dreaming of being a writer phase for a long time where I was like I had these ideas of like the novel I would one day write. But I think a part of being so young and then also like being in that environment where you're studying with the greatest authors who have ever lived in the English language. It's pretty intimidating, right? Because you're like, oh, I'm reading Shakespeare today, and then Jane Austen, and then George Orwell, and then it's like, and then I'm gonna try to struggle through my rough draft, and I don't have a lot of life experience yet. So most of my first attempts at writing were just like they were bad. I kind of knew they were bad, and I didn't have the discipline to like force myself through it in order to get better, right? Because
Mhm.
yeah, I'd be like, well, my first draft it's not Jane Austen, it's not Dickens, it's not Shakespeare. So then you're like, well, I'm just
Throw it
not even gonna
away.
bother. Yeah, exactly. So I didn't really take fiction writing seriously until after I finished the PhD. And so the good thing with that, it was nonfiction, it's like academic writing, but a dissertation is mine was like 250 pages by the end of it. And that is not something you can bang out in an all-nighter fueled by caffeine. You need to develop discipline. So that was really where I learned how to like write every day for long periods of time and kind of figure out, what times a day work for me and like how I have to get into that ritual. So by the time I finally finished, it was like early 2020. So COVID had just hit. And I hit submit on my dissertation and I was waiting for the defense. I think that was April of 2020. So the lockdown was still very recent. Um, and I developed that habit of writing and I was like, you know what, I feel like I'm missing a limb now because I'm so used to like every day, okay, I need to write, I need to write, I need to write. But then I was like, well, I don't need to write now, but like I feel like I should. And also there's nothing to do because we're in lockdown. So that was when I decided like I'm gonna take the whole fiction writing thing seriously and see like if I can write a novel. So that first novel I worked on will never see the light of day. That was my practice novel. I did not finish it. I got like 80,000 words into it and then decided this is not going anywhere. But I learned a lot about what not to do in that. And I was reading up about the craft and all of that. with writing and learning, and then applying that to my manuscript and seeing that it wasn't quite there. And so then I started working on other things. Kind of fast forward 5 years later, I wrote the first book in the Lays of Athewain, son of the Thunder Goddess. And so I finished that I think I finished the final draft in like July or August of 2024. And then at that point, I had decided I wanted to look into self-publishing. I'd already done a lot of research into it, but I was like, okay, I'm going to try this for myself. So I gave myself a nice kind of on-ramp. And with a publication date in March of 2025. And then the whole buildup was just me figuring out things and being like, oh, I was supposed to do this. I was supposed to do that. I think I
What?
managed to get most of the things done on the checklist. And then I published that book. And then I followed up with the sequel, Rage of the Raven Queen, in November of 2025.
Wow. That is like, oh, I have so many things that I want to ask you. I had like questions lined up and then almost immediately those got blown away and now I have more questions. So, would you like to introduce us to what your series is about before I?
Yes. Yeah, so the kind of the really quick elevator pitch is it's about a shepherd named Athewain, whose whole village is wiped out by a demigod. And so while he's kind of in the ruins of his village, he comes into contact with this mysterious unknown god who gives him power in order for him to take out his revenge. But as he's pursuing his revenge, he's getting drawn into this much larger cosmic conflict, like a war of the gods. And so in book one, it's very focused on Athelwain's revenge on this demigod. And then in book two, the gods kind of strike back. And so everything becomes much more dramatic and escalating, and you get more of that conflict of the gods. Book three, I'm working on right now, is going to continue that conflict. And so each book is kind of gradually drawing the hero into uh, sort of bigger and bigger stakes where he's really in over his head, and then he has to try to rely on this mysterious god they doesn't fully understand.
Sweet. Does that growth of cosmic stakes get reflected in the size? Because I'm just looking at the difference. Is the
It
third one
does,
going to be
yeah.
like,
The third one, well, so I'm really bad at estimating word count. So book one was originally I thought of as a short story idea. And then the second one was going to be similar in length to book one. And then as soon as I started writing it, I was like, actually, this is going to be like 3 times as long. Um, and so I think the third book is going to be similar to book two, but then book four is going to be way bigger.
I think that's kind of normal
Yeah.
for it to
Yeah.
grow because you're like adding characters, you're building the world out
Hmm.
more. Like, yeah, that's I think it's kind of fun. I think people look forward to
Hmm.
that because once they're in there, they want more. Did you always know that fantasy was going to be where you wanted to land as far as fiction, or when you were starting the fiction thing, was it kind of just that's what you picked?
So originally, like back in my university days, I was pretty focused on like historical fiction, actually.
Hmm.
Um, and so there's crossover in that I've always been interested in like medieval and ancient history, and so the historical fiction um, I tinkered with was always like Viking or Anglo-Saxon medieval. Um, and then I think I tried literary fiction once, but it was just not a good fit
Haven't we
at
all?
all. Yeah, I enjoy reading it, but
Yeah.
I'm not cut out for that genre at all.
It's a different beast for
It
sure.
is.
I don't think I have it either. But okay, so yeah, it was kind of an intersection of a few different interests of yours. And then while you were going through your schooling, was that, sorry if I missed it, but like were you taking creative writing courses as part of your English, or was it more of like a literature stream where you're more reading and responding?
Yeah, I didn't take any creative writing courses. I thought about it at one point, but I was too scared to take one because then I would have to write creative fiction and share it with people. Um, and like I didn't really develop the confidence to do that until after I was already out of my undergrad.
That is very fair. That was actually something I struggled with a lot in university. My first 2 years, I was in the literature stream, and then when I transferred, I ended up in more of a writing focused stream, which ended up being amazing. But I had so much anxiety about it. Like, oh no, I'm gonna have to write on demand every week, things that can't be fully polished, or they might ask me to write something on the spot and then share it by the end of the class. Like that's not how Nikki rolls. And so there was a lot of stress around that, so I get it, but it did end up being very valuable. I would be curious to know how, yeah, just as far as genre goes. I know that when I was in those streams, I felt like fantasy was um, hard to pull into creative writing in a university context. I felt like I don't know. Maybe it was me projecting, but I felt like, oh no, like will I be judged or like seen as like lesser because this is like an academic context. So I was curious as to like how you kind of arrived there. But that's interesting that it kind of married your different interests already.
Yeah, I don't think you're just projecting there. I mean, at least
Okay.
I at least as far as I understand academia, like it is very slow to embrace like not even new things because fantasy's been around since at least Lord of the Rings if you want to be very simplistic. And that's kind of you've kind of touched on one of my pet peeves because
Mm,
um if you think about the way we canonize literature in English, um when you hit the 20th century, you get that like the bifurcation of what's considered high art and then kind of like low art, the writing for like the common people who don't have taste. Um,
right.
and and then the high art is all deliberately obscure, right? So like
Hmm.
even just beginning with like the modernists and I love T.S. Eliot and The Wasteland, but it's not a poem that you can pick up with limited
Hmm.
education and understand, right? Like
Right.
that's a
It's not
really
accessible.
complicated dense but it's not, and that's I think more accessible than a lot of it comes after in the kind of avant-garde. And then you have someone like Tolkien, um, who is very clearly writing in the tradition of the canon. Like, he's drawing on Beowulf and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight and Milton and Shakespeare and like all of the like these figures from the past. But because that's not the way the Academy went, then you would not see Lord of the Rings in an English syllabus until very recently. Universities have started doing it more, but for so long, it's like you you will read like modernist poetry and postmodern poetry, and then genre fiction, like science fiction and fantasy, is like kind of considered like lowbrow, and so I can see that being reflected in creative writing as well. That even the kinds of people who get hired for creative writing are probably writing literary fiction, not like fantasy or romance or the genres that really sell well.
So,
Yeah,
so what are your, I mean, you mentioned that it's a pet peeve, which I mean, fair enough.
yeah,
Me too. It's
yeah.
it's a pet peeve
Mm,
because it's a beautiful, beautiful genre that's so versatile. And
hmm.
just because it is widely loved and widely appreciated does not mean that it's lesser in value. So, like in your position, you see both worlds because you're writing
Hmm.
fantasy, but you also kind of know the inner workings of academia and how they make those kinds of decisions. Like how do you navigate that? Do you feel like you can kind of bridge your academic experience and pull that into your fantasy? And like what would you say the value of fantasy is if you had to sell it?
Mm. I mean, I feel like I would go even like back to what are most of the foundational texts. I mean, even before English, if you go into Greek and Roman literature, and then early like Anglo-Saxon, medieval, Renaissance literature, most of the great works we study, they're not fantasy genre because that genre didn't exist back then, but they're fantastical. Like you have gods and heroes and epic battles and dragons and the sword and the stone and the Holy Grail. Like this is all very fantastical. And so like that the history of what we call literary fiction is pretty much like 18th century and on of like realism, and like stories about kind of regular people, and really like 19th century. So it's such a small band of human literature that then for some reason has become like this is true literature. This is great literature, and then anything that is like more fantastical, more popular is kind of inherently seen as like lesser. So I would say that yeah, I think like um stories in and of themselves are fantasy in a sense that even if you're writing about like if I were to write a book about a 34-year-old English professor who lives in Canada, right? Like I'm even though like I'm not imagining most of those elements because those are all true of me, but I'm still creating something and it's still fantastical in the sense of like it's not a memoir, it's not a true story. Um, and so like where we draw that line is pretty arbitrary, I think, of of like what gets considered fantasy and what is considered like literature with a capital L. And so I just I always like to think of like what is the biggest sort of scope we can we can look at. And so rather than comparing everything to like you know early 20th century or 19th century, look at all of literature and like it seems like the earliest stories we have are what we could categorize as fantasy. And so like the impetus for human beings like writing down stories was like we want to capture this myth that isn't literally true, but like says something true about the world that you can't say just within the confines of realism. Um, so that's where I think the reason I think I've shifted more towards fantasy than historical fiction, which one day I might go into historical fiction proper, but I like that with fantasy you can say things about the world and you can get across certain truths that if you're strictly tied into what we think of as realism, you're more limited by, I think.
Yeah, that's something that I've thought about a lot, and that's one thing when I'm trying to articulate what the value of this genre, if we want to call it a genre, is. Like, I think it does allow you to convey things because people are willingly stepping into that space and they let their guard down. And so you can wrap up ideas and truths in this kind of fantastical way that is so immersive, and it leaves room for people to think about it themselves and to walk away potentially changed by it, or to just put a pebble in their shoe. And so it's like, I don't know, it feels less heavy-handed. It feels like a great
Mhm.
vehicle for saying things and for packing in a lot of meaning, but also packaging that as a gift for people to unwrap themselves, as opposed to, like you said, when it is more in a realism space, I feel like it can be very direct and on the nose because you
Mhm.
you don't have that same room to, like, I don't know, create like something a little more nebulous that people have to interpret for themselves because it's the world they know. So
Mhm.
that's just kind of my take on that. But you mentioned your interest in like mythology, and obviously in this series in particular, mythology comes into play. You can tell that right away. And research. Like I have read the first one, so hopefully that will prevent me from any spoilers because I haven't finished the second one yet. If I do get into spoiler territory, please tell me. But yeah, you could tell right away that you are very familiar with the subject matter, with some of the material that you used for research. For one thing, what Lays of Athewain? What does that mean?
Okay, yes. I've gotten that question a bunch of times. So I think that maybe shows my academic bubble that I was like, everyone knows what a lay is, and then almost everyone has been like, what is a lay? So a lay is a it comes from medieval Brittany, so that like northwestern France. And it is a genre of poetry. It's kind of the precursor to the medieval romance. So sometimes you'll see it spelled as like Lai or Lay, and so like they were kind of like chivalric romance stories about a knight going on a fantastical quest. Some of them involved King Arthur, some of them involved like werewolves and other creatures. And then it's kind of morphed since then, kind of in the way that like other genres like ballads are we can use them in ways that are not quite as strict as like the origin or even epic, right? So Tolkien also has lays, like in his non-Lord of the Rings writing, he has like the Lay of Luthien. It's kind
Mm.
of like a heroic story that belongs to a mythic past.
Okay, that's awesome. I feel so much smarter now. I feel like I have maybe heard that somewhere, but it was probably in the context of Tolkien, and I just took it for granted that it was something erudite that not for the common man, not for the likes of me. Okay, I have one question sort of related to that and just like the research component. Um, when you were writing this book, did you feel like you already had your research foundation and you just went for writing because you'd been learning this so much, or was there actually a research process specifically for this series?
Yeah, I definitely had a good foundation already, which is why I chose the kind of Iron Age Britain setting. Um, that's a period I've been interested in for a while. It's fun because there's very little we actually know about it, like because the Celtic peoples who lived in Britain didn't have a written language, so everything we know about them is written by Roman historians, a few Greek historians, who are, you know, as you can imagine, pretty biased, and they're like, what are these strange barbarians in Britain doing? But I love that for fantasy because it's so evocative, because it's like you get these little pieces of information. Even like Stonehenge belongs to pre-Roman Britain, and we know very little about Stonehenge. Like we can study it and be like, it lines up with the heavenly bodies, but like, you know, how much of it was religious, how much was scientific, and people's imaginations can just kind of run wild with that. I picked that period because I already knew quite a bit about it, but then to get into the zone while writing, I was reading more primary sources just to kind of have that language and that feel um, kind of at hand. So I read through Caesar's Gallic War, which again is written by a very biased Roman guy, but he's very interested, even though he's conquering these people, he's really interested in like their way of life and like what makes them tick, and he'll say like, you know, oh, they have more honor than we do in certain areas. It didn't stop him from conquering them, but he's like, you know, I'll give them credit.
Respect. Yeah.
Yeah, respect. And then there would be little things that would come up where I didn't think to research when I was just reading the stuff for fun, but then you think of as you're writing when, say, like I have in the first book, someone dies, right? Like someone very important, and so they're dealing with his body and like they have a funeral, and I'm like, okay, so what were the Celtic funeral rites like at the time? And not that I have to follow it, but I'm like, I feel like fantasy feels more real when you're basing it on real practices rather than just making stuff up. Because then, if I'm just making stuff up completely, it's probably going to have a very modern flair because I'm a modern person, and my assumptions of what is normal are going to look very different from what like a Bronze Age or an Iron Age person would think of. And so I would kind of look at that, and then if we're like, well, we don't really know, but it could be A or B, then I'd be like, I like A better, so I'm just gonna use that. And that was kind of my approach to like the battle scenes, and I'm dealing with like funerals and even the role of druids, because we druids are very popular, but we don't actually know tons about how they operated, and so a lot of what you find if you just Google, especially with AI, is just total nonsense. Um, but it works well for fantasy because you can you can kind of use it as a vibe rather than like actual history. But I tried to be accurate where possible, but then still creating fantasy out of it.
Okay, you set me up really well because I was going to ask about whether when you're working with real historical material and using that as a launch pad if that ever becomes restricting. And specifically, I kind of wanted to pull that into some of the spiritual ties in your story. So, like, it's written on the back here, one of your endorsements, like someone compares it to David and Goliath. And
Mhm.
that's a very strong kind of like motif that comes through, which I thought was really cool. And I really appreciated what you said in like the interview, like the written interview that will be going out on my newsletter soon. So everybody sign up for my newsletter on my website if you want to hear more about this. I really appreciated your insight there. And I know for me in the past, when I was doing my first kind of passion project, I think I was like 15, it was very Moses inspired. And so I borrowed a lot of things from the Moses story that really, really inspired me because the Bible is this amazing resource, like this is amazing bottomless source of creative inspiration. But while doing that, I also had places that I wanted to take the story, places I felt the story was going that were nothing like Moses, but I wasn't sure if I was allowed to kind of veer off. And so I started to feel like I needed to kind of cram my story, like cram that square peg into a round hole and try and make it allegory because I wasn't sure
Mm.
where that place was where I could start jumping off and creating my own based on the framework. And so I was curious to hear how that looks for you and how you approached writing a story, say, about a pantheon of gods from a
Mm.
position of faith. What role does the spirit play in your writing process for stories like this?
Yeah. Um, so funnily enough, with that first book, I didn't even think about the David and Goliath connections until someone pointed it out, and I was like, "Oh yeah, actually, this story is about a shepherd who's facing this guy who's like he's not a giant, but he's kind of like very Goliath coated." And they face off before the two armies, and so I wasn't consciously trying to model it on David and Goliath. I had in my head this kind of idea of like I want to merge sort of three things like the like Greek and Roman mythology, like the Iliad, the kind of like the epic speeches and duels and the chariot warfare because I love that. And then Celtic sort of setting, which also works really well with the heroic combat and like the two guys just like insulting each other's moms and then throwing spears and all of that. But then that also connects really well with the Bible because that's pretty it seems to be pretty standard of a lot of those early Bronze Age, Iron Age um, uh, civilizations that like their combat tends to feature these duels between the two
Mm.
champions. And so I had all of that in my head, and then also I was like, okay, we know the story of how God revealed himself to people in the past as recorded in the Bible, right? So that's what we already have it as what has happened. But I kind of think of in my fantasy storytelling, like sort of an alternative timeline of like, so that is the way that God has revealed himself, but how might that happen in a different context, right? So just because that is what happened, it doesn't mean that God would have to do that every time, right? Like he's not bound by that just because that is what we have our in in the record of the Bible. And then another thing I've always found interesting is that for Old Testament writers, they're not as clear on like what these other gods are, right? Like when you get into early Christianity and like Augustine, he's like they're demons, full stop,
Right.
fake, right? But like it seems for a lot of the ancient Hebrew writers, they're like, no, these gods have like they have an existence of some kind. They're but they're still false gods. And so the idea of being false doesn't mean like you just made it up. They're fake. They have no power. It's like they do have power. They have an existence, but they're not ultimately sovereign. They're not actually like the creator. They're not the god we're supposed to be worshiping, but like Baal and Moloch and all those gods that the Israelites are always, overly intrigued by, and they're not supposed to be worshiping. Um, it's not like super cut. and dry that like these are just fake. And so I think again for fantasy, I don't have to like n- I don't have to come down on that issue with like an academic, here's the truth. But I think it works really well, at least from a narrative perspective, to imagine that these are real powers, that these are that you do have gods who are being worshipped as gods, but they're kind of like usurpers in a way. So without getting into what gets revealed more in book two, um, there's a pantheon, so it's polytheist, but then there's also a one god, and so it's kind of monotheist. And so like the academic term for that idea is monolatry or henotheism. And so it's like you have many gods, but you have one god among those gods. And so I was really interested with the narrative possibilities of that, where it's like there is a thunder goddess, there is a war goddess, there is a sun god, there are lots of other gods that I'm going to get into in the series. But then there's the maker is all they know about him in the first book, and he seems to be like even older than these other gods, and he's been forgotten. And so I was really interested in like how would someone in a pagan society where they just assume these are the gods, full stop, how would God reveal himself to someone where there's no Bible that they can read? There are no missionaries, like just like pure special revelation, but like not from the gospel, from like God himself, in the way that God we see God do that with Abraham, right? Where Abraham has no context for God and he's living in a pagan world and God just kind of plucks him up out of that. And so like kind of merging that with a Celtic setting and a lot of Greek mythology vibes. Um, that was kind of my thought. So it's like I view it as like I want the character of God and the theology to be in line with what I believe as a Christian, but then for the actual like plot of how that goes down, I feel comfortable changing things as long as it still feels true to me.
Yeah, I appreciate that so much. I love that idea of the kind of alternate universe approach where it's like, yeah, like God, this is how he chose to do things in our context, but in another place that looks completely different, how would that potentially look different? Like he's not necessarily bound. I really appreciate that. And I think that viewers will appreciate that too. I know a while back I posted a video about just kind of my struggle with the fantasy genre and my kind of angst around that kind of stuff. And like so many people felt the same and were really battling that. So I really hope that that is helpful for you guys and encouraging. And thank you so much for sharing your thoughts there. As we approach time for our first segment, I just want to thank you again for joining me and also to give you the chance to talk about your serial exciting news that just dropped. So take it away.
Yeah, okay, great. So I am going to be experimenting with a serialization on my Substack, which is called The Mead Hall. And so the serial novel, the title is War of Princes. It takes place in the same world as the Lays of Athewain, but hundreds of years after, in a medieval setting. And it is the first chapter is launching April 17th. You can subscribe for free and read a chapter a week. And you can get the blurb and the cover if you go to the Beat Hall, or just go to andrewlevecchi.com/serial, and then that should take you there as well.
We'll drop all of that below and make sure that you have all of it. Definitely go and check it out. That is super exciting. And thank you everybody for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Tune in for our next segment. Bye!